Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Man, you know what? I was watching a video of Maurice Ashley playing chess in a park in New York, and he was like playing. He was just like, just getting down to the music. So, I just thought that was kind of funny. Anyways, I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. As you guys do know, we have the Chess Olympiad going on, and so the United States played India today. And so we have Wesley versus Vidit Gujrathi. So, of course, all my people that are coming from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay. Kamusta na aking makaibigan? Hello ulit to you. Let me see. Magandang umaga. It is 4 o'clock in the morning over there, so pretty early. So, almasal tayo. If you already eating breakfast, like I know some people do at like 5 o'clock. And anybody who is coming from India, I will say namaskar and dhanyavad. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. But if you guys are ready to go, we will see what we have for this game. All right, so we got e4, e5, knight to f3. We got knight to c6, bishop to c4, knight to f6, d3, and then we have bishop to c5. The most explosive, powerful opening in all of chess. No, I'm playing. But you guys know Giuoco Pianissimo is the opening. So that just means very quiet game in Italian. But these games are rarely quiet, as I always say. So we do have castles by white. We got d6. We got the move c3. We don't want this knight creeping in, at all. Because, maybe it could take all our pieces. You never know. So we do have a5. This bishop is preferred to be on the square that it is on. So a5 is just really discouraging the move b4 from coming. So if you really want to play that move, then you'll have to go a3 and then push b4 like that. But not now, because this rook is kind of lonely in the corner. So we do see rook over to e1. We got bishop back to a7. Knight comes up to a3, which, I mean, you're thinking of at some point redirecting it around, so it's not going to live on a3. So, of course, putting it on a3 forever is not the ideal, situation. You might have some thoughts of bringing it back to c2, just to kind of help with a d4 pawn push. We do see castles by black. We got h3. We got h6. So, everybody, has their luft out of the way. And then we do have knight to b5, because why not try to grab a bishop, bro? Die, right? It's like, let me just snap you off. And of course, black does not want that, because, this bishop is actually doing a really good job on this diagonal, especially since the rook has moved. This is a pretty tender point. So we want to keep that bishop on. So we do see bishop coming to b6. Bishop comes to e3. And now this is pretty much forcing the trade, but it is a more preferred trade for black. To trade the bishop for bishop instead of the knight for the bishop. So the bishop does take e3. We got rook taking e3. Rook sliding over to e8. We see queen to c2. And then we see the novelty of the game, which is knight to e7. And I'm going to mention something right here. We got queen to b3. So some of you guys might be wondering, okay, wait a minute. All right. So we started on d1 with the queen. We moved to c2. And then we moved to b3 now. Like, why did we take 2 moves to move to b3? Like, can't you just go queen to b3 immediately? Well, the interesting thing about the situation is a lot of the times when you have the ability to push d5, it does weaken this possible pawn. So to discourage that, queen to c2 is a very logical move. And it is only after the knight blocks the rook on e8 that we then now move queen to b3. So it doesn't seem like it makes some sense, but after that explanation, you can kind of see, what Wesley So's thought process was behind moving c2 and then moving to b3. So we do see the rook coming back over to f8. Of course we are, f7 and f2 are always very tender squares. So, we have to defend that somehow. And what we're also thinking of doing right here is trying to prevent the bishop from developing where it wants. Because, of course, you can't go here, you can't go here, and then going here is undesirable because you're just going to be losing an entire pawn. So, that is something else that white is trying to do. So after the rook goes to f8, we see d4. Pawn takes d4, and knight b takes d4, which does, well, it's not isolating a pawn. You're good. And we do see the move d5, which does ultimately isolate. Well, no, it doesn't isolate. No, we're good. Never mind. Scratch what I'm saying. We do see knight e taking d5. We see rook going up to e5. You know, we're just hoping black just kind of falls asleep and doesn't realize that their knight is you know, over attacked. But Vidit says, hey man, I'm not sleepy. I got a lot of sleep last night. I'm fresh. So he does go, you know, the move c6, so protects the knight. We do see rook a to e1. We see queen down to d6. And in the game, which is a really kind of like cute move that was played, is actually knight to b5, which might look a little bit strange at the moment, because why did I just move this knight right here next to this pawn? Because that's dangerous, right? Well, like I said before, this c6 move is defending this knight. So if you have a situation where the pawn captures here, you are undefending this, you know, this knight. So it's an even trade. Plus, you know, you have, you know, black has kind of a weakened pawn too. So, like I said, that is what we saw in the game. But we have come to the point in the game that if you do want to pause the video, there is another idea in this position that is actually very strong. And it would have really been interesting to see this played in the game. If you want to go ahead and pause the video and see what move this is and what kind of idea is behind it, go ahead and do so. Okay, so this actually becomes a very simple answer once you have like the correct thought process, you know, behind playing, you know, the game of chess. And the major thing that I'm talking about in this position is, you know, you guys have heard all the time about, you know, somebody saying you want to look for like undefended pieces. And another thing that is commonly talked about is looking at your own position. And of course, making sure that you don't have anything going on. But looking at your position and trying to see, you know, what pieces are, you know, not as ideally placed as they could be. And like how you can try to improve the piece. And so if you look at the position, you will notice that, I mean, these rooks are doing really good. They're completely controlling this file. You know, the bishop and the queen are, you know, kind of combating to get, you know, get against the f7 square, the f7 pawn. This knight is beautifully placed. And it's not that this piece is badly placed, but you're just trying to think, okay, like what can I do for this piece to maximize it? And the piece is this knight right here. And so you're thinking, I mean, it's doing a good job on f3. You know, it's a very logical developing, you know, square. But you're thinking, is there a way that I can improve the piece? And so if you think about that, then the square that should jump out to you is f5. And so, of course, you're not going to be, you know, you don't really want to move that rook, that knight there immediately. But this knight going to h4 has the ability to redirect itself onto f5. And then you have a situation like so. And not only that, but you are going to be getting a tempo on the queen. So if we just kind of play through some moves in that particular situation, you would see knight going to h4. You would probably want to counterattack as black. And this also, this idea, it does kind of force black to play a certain kind of way. So, you know, even though it's not like worlds better than knight to b5, it's one of those situations where if Vidit Gujrathi does not like play the correct sequence of moves, then he can get himself into a bad position. And, you know, maybe Wesley, so, you know, could like hook the game up. You never know. So the knight does come back to d7, attacking the rook. The knight does come h to f5, which does gain that tempo on the queen. But black has the ability to counterattack, which is a4, hitting the queen. Queen coming back to c2. We see queen over to f6. Knight to e7 with check. Knight takes e7. Rook takes e7. And then we do have the move b5. So this is, you know, a very solid position for white. But like I said, you know, it did greatly test. This is basically like computer moves that it just gave for like the past 4 or 5 moves that Gujrathi would have had to have found to make sure that he maintained his position. So like I said, it would have been interesting to see that. But we do see knight to b5. And of course, you don't want to just capture here because you're going to be, you know, hitting that. And then, I mean, you have so much that's going to be on this pawn. You're just pretty much going to be eating a pawn. So we do see the queen coming back to d8. We see rook over to d1. The bishop comes to d7. And now you have to do something because you have just unpinned this knight to the queen. So, I mean, you know, something's going to have to give. So we see bishop taking d5, pawn taking d5, a knight b coming back to d4. The queen coming over to c7. So, I mean, both sides have pretty much gotten, you know, the exact positions that they want. And then white is just thinking about trying to overtake the e-file again. But because you do have double rooks for black, you don't have the ability to do that. So rook f to e8. We see rook takes e8, rook takes e8, and then we see rook takes e8, bishop takes e8. We got knight over to f5. We see b5. We got the move a3. And I mean, basically, we have just kind of stopped these pawns in their track. You know, we have enough, you know, between the queen and these two pawns on this b4 square. So these pawns aren't going anywhere. And the main focus is just making sure this pawn doesn't go anywhere as well. Queen goes to c5. We see queen down to d1. The only problem with this move is it kind of abandons the post and it kind of abandoned what I just got done talking about. You know, you now literally immediately have the ability to push b4, which is a great, you know, increase in the position for black. We do see the move b4, pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, and then the queen does come to d4. Queen takes d4, pawn takes d4, king goes over to f8. We see knight up to e5. We see knight down to e4, just trying to improve your piece as much as possible. We do see knight down to e3, and I mean, we're putting a nice little attack on this pawn here. And after this pawn falls, you do have the ability to start to try to take that pawn too. So the knight does come down to d6, and we see the move b3, which does restrict the knight's movement here, but that's not really too big of a concern. You have both of these knights right here, so b3, you know, doesn't really serve the greatest purpose. Now, if you back up, after the knight came to d6, you probably would be thinking, I mean, can't we just snap the pawn off of d5? Isn't it just like a pawn? Well, the crazy thing is it actually is a pawn, and it is definitely something that you can do. Knight takes d5, knight goes to b5, knight takes b4, knight takes d4, and you would be absolutely correct if this was something that you guessed or that you figured, like, why not, right? And we will be coming back to this position in just a second, but like I said, after we saw b3, we saw the knight coming back to b7. We saw knight down to d3, knight to a5. We see knight up to c5, protecting the pawn on b3. We see the knight back to c6, knight down to c2. So, I mean, you can see that black is attacking, you know, white is defending. So, I mean, it's pretty locked at the moment. King comes to e7. We see knight down to d3. We got knight over to a5. The knight takes a b4. Knight B takes knight D takes b4. Knight takes b3, and then we do see knight taking d5 with check. The king goes down to d6, and then we see knight D to e3. Now, like I said, I was going to be going back to that position. So it might seem like the position you saw a second ago and this position are pretty much identical, right? But this is something that you want to keep in mind. When you are playing, you know, chess games where you have minor pieces or you just have a king and pawn versus a king and some pawns or something like that, you always want to try to put yourself in a position to make it as hard as possible for your opponent. And so one of the things as far as this position goes is anytime, you know, one side can keep pawns on just one side of the board in an endgame, it's going to be a lot easier for the king to work that type of position out. So you do have an extra pawn as white, but it is more in the center of the board. So as you can see, I mean, for the most part, the pawns are kind of clumped in the same general area. So as you can imagine, with the king only being able to move one square at a time, it's a lot easier for the king to kind of like, you know, kind of corral and, you know, try to, you know, control that. Plus, I mean, you know, you have two minor pieces as well that's helping you out. So be a little different if you had like less minor pieces. But pay attention to this position here and see that we have a pass pawn on the d file. So even though that is legitimate, if we go back to the position that we saw before, there you notice a slight difference in the situation. So now we have a pass pawn and it's all the way over on the b file. So one thing that you want to try to make sure that you're doing when you're playing your games is try as much as possible to create the farthest, what we call outside pass pawn that you can. And then that way it just makes it a little bit hard for your opponent. This is a really hard game for black to try to win. And white pretty much has all the winning chances in this particular position. But if we go to the position we saw in the game, knight coming to e3, and you have that pass pawn on, you know, the D file here. And this knight is doing a pretty good job of attacking it and kind of holding white down. This is a dead even position, so a little bit of difference. So we see G6, we see the move F3, we got F5, we see G3. The king goes over to E6, and like I said, you can see how, you know, the king, you know, can make a couple movements either way, and they're doing a pretty good job of kind of staying in front of everything, as opposed to if that pawn was over on the B file. We see king to F2. We got G5. We got F4. Bishop comes to C6, just kind of cutting that king off on that diagonal. We see the knight going to knight going to C4, bishop to E4. And, you know, we really are trying to get rid of the defense of this pawn, but we do have the move knight 4 to A3. Pawn takes F4, pawn takes F4. The king comes down to D5. We see king up to E3. So as you can see, I mean, both sides are pretty much able to hold the position. Neither side really has an advantage. We got bishop taking C2, knight taking C2. We see king down to C4. The knight goes to A3, hitting the check. The king goes over to B4. Knight goes down to C2 with check. King goes back to C4. We got H4, H5. The knight comes back to A3 with check. King goes back to B4. Knight down to B1. The king goes over to C4, attacking that pawn. And I mean, we're pretty much going to be losing the pawn. So, you know, you decide to go ahead and push it. You know, you want to try to give away pawns sometimes to try to deflect the piece. So, I mean, that's pretty much what you're looking at here. The king takes on D5. We see knight to C3 with check. King goes to E6. We see knight to E2. The king goes over to F6. We see knight going to G3. Of course, we're like, hey, man, let's try to grab this pawn on the H file, right? But, I mean, the king is in the perfect position. And like I said, that is why it is a lot easier when you have pawns on just one side of the board as opposed to two. The winning chances go way up when you have, you know, pawns on, you know, different sides of the board. The king goes to D3. We see knight to C5 with check. King goes up to D4, knight to E6 with check. The king comes up to E5. So it seems like white is making progress. But we do see knight down to C5. The knight goes down to E2. The knight comes to D3 with check. The king goes down to D4. We see knight down to E1. The king goes to E3. And then we do see the move king to F6. And like I said, pretty much every single possible variation is drawn. You know, these pawns are severely locked. So they're really not going anywhere. And I mean, this king just needs to kind of hang around out over here. And this king just kind of needs to just do what it's doing. And I mean, that is that. So the game in this position is agreed drawn, with neither side being able to make progress. So that is that game taken out of round 10. Wait, no, 11. I will have to fix my thumbnail. It is round 11, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I'll figure out which one it is. The thumbnail will be correct at the end of the day. But I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by, and I'll see y'all next time.